Chapter 2. It was finally happening for Veronica. Her band had landed a supporting slot on a big tour. She loved singing in a band. She loved singing. As a kid, she sang in a few musicals, but that journey ended when she discovered rock music. Eventually, she found a group of like-minded and dedicated musicians as they formed their band. They grinded it out through the years of playing small clubs and dive bars, slowly honing and refining their sound. Recently, they began picking up steam and gaining a small following thanks to the internet and social media. Then the big break came. They were invited on tour with a much larger band. Every night they would get 30 minutes in front of sold-out crowds. Every night was an opportunity to win over new fans, and it was going well. When everything changed over, Veronica was going through her pre-performance routine. She still had about 5 minutes until the band took the stage. The sounds of the crowd coming through the curtains gave her life. How many new fans would the band convert tonight? Her mind flashed through the set list. She always liked to memorize it. Every morning before a show, the band would get together over coffee and decide which songs they'd fill their slot with. Although their entire catalog was still small, it was more than enough to fill their allotted time. So cuts had to be made, and they liked to keep it fresh. For themselves, not for the crowd, since most were hearing them for the first time. Once it was settled, she would spend the day committing it to memory and visualizing the night's performance. She closed her eyes and visualized the entire set on fast forward. She felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Kent. He whispered, 2 minutes, into her ear. Then his hand was gone. She didn't feel it lift off her shoulder. It was just gone. A jolt ran through her body and her stomach dropped like on a roller coaster. Something was not right. Gone was the sound of the crowd, replaced with confused murmuring that would soon become screaming. She felt small, confined. Everything was wrong. When her vision finally returned, she found that she was no longer backstage in her body. She was in an aisle seat on an airplane in the body of a small boy. She never got a look at her new self in the mirror, and things happened so fast that she never truly registered that she was in a new, foreign body anyway. Everyone on the plane was experiencing the same unexplainable phenomenon, including the person in the pilot's body. Within minutes, the plane was going down, and there was no one who could stop it. Veronica was supposed to be getting ready to take the stage with her band. A handful of the people in the large crowd might have known their music. Everyone else would be hearing it for the first time and hopefully become converts. It had been happening at every show. She was supposed to be looking at herself in the mirror, making final preparations before her performance, not watching the city of London get dangerously close through the window as screams around her grew louder and the realization of what was about to happen washed over her. She was supposed to be living her life. Instead, she died when the plane ricocheted off a couple buildings before crashing into a fiery explosion that would ignite nearly half of London. One of the many senseless losses in the wake of the Great Mix-Up. Chapter 3. Margot was asleep when it happened. She slept a lot in those days due to her age and condition. 91 years old, failing health, living in a nursing home. Her husband was long dead. Her nearest child lived nearly 1,000 miles away. None of her grandchildren any closer. They all had their own lives far from the last gasps of hers. There were no visitors outside of holidays and her birthday. Thanks to technology, she received the occasional video call. Mostly, she texted or emailed, but even those were few and far between. She never had much to say anyway. She simply listened, or read intently as whichever family member was filling her in on what was happening in their life. If she was being totally honest, she would have told you that she was ready to go, but no one bothered to ask. Someone would have had to talk to her for that. Really talk to her, not just talk at her. There was no specific disease ravaging her. She never had cancer, or MS, or any other malady that takes people down as they age. Instead, what she suffered from was simple. Good old-fashioned old age wear and tear. Organs and bones that simply no longer wanted to do their job. Some bodies are built to last longer than others. Sometime in her mid-80s, things started to fall apart. By 91, she was being held together by the medical equivalent of duct tape and chewing gum. Bad lungs, bad liver, bad kidney, bad back, bad hips, bad knees, general lethargy. Most recently, she had stumbled while getting out of bed, fallen and broken her right hip. Aside from medically necessary assisted walks, she was completely bedridden. At least there was no pain. She had medical science to thank for that. The sad thing was that her mind was fine. She was still sharp, as mentally present as she had been when she was 40. It was only the body that was betraying her. Not a moment went by when she didn't feel weak, frail, and tired. Simply reaching for the remote to change the channel or swiping around on her tablet had become a chore. She slept more than she would have liked. The drugs had a hand in that. When she was awake, she kept her mind busy. Between reading books and streaming movies, there was always something to occupy that active, curious imagination. Unlike most at her age, she hadn't let technology pass her by. She was quite computer savvy, which came in handy. Her body may not have been up to most tasks, but with a tablet in hand, she could still connect with the world, entertain, and educate herself. She just had to tolerate the discomfort. She even followed some of her grandchildren on social media. The old days were something she tried not to think about. She had never taken her youth or her body for granted. She'd been active. She'd traveled. She'd seen and done more than most people could ever hope for. She was ready. But it wasn't her time yet. She still had things to do. She was lost in a very deep, drug-induced, dream-filled sleep when everything changed over. Before she saw anything, she smelled it. Bacon. That unforgettable scent of bacon sizzling in a frying pan, pouring into her nostrils and igniting her senses. A smell she'd experienced many times when she was younger and never thought she'd experience again. When her vision slowly blinked back into focus, she could see clearly. In her old body, she had basically been blind and needed very thick glasses to see anything. Suddenly, everything was clearer than it had been in decades. She was standing over a pan of sizzling bacon in the bright kitchen with natural light streaming in through the windows. It shocked her. It blinded her. The new body disoriented her. The fact that she was standing without difficulty was jarring, and there really was no difficulty. She no longer felt even remotely sore, tight, or achy. She was looser than she'd felt in decades, stronger than she'd been in her entire life. Plus, she could see, but she wasn't ready for it. After so many years of pain and weakness, she had forgotten how to handle a healthy body, especially one that wasn't hers. She stumbled around, completely out of balance. She threw her right hand out, hoping to find something to hold. What it found was the handle of the frying pan. The weight and force of her hand sent the bacon and its grease splashing into the air all around and at her. If jumping into a different body wasn't disorienting enough, the pain of boiling bacon grease splashing her left shoulder and arm certainly was. She was lucky it mostly missed her face. Mostly. 2 drops hit her lower jawline, and 1 landed next to her ear. There would be some light scarring, but she would cover up that with her beard she'd eventually grow. She'd always kind of wanted to try growing a beard. Her shoulder and arm, however, now featured burn scars that would stay with her for a few years. They would fade with time, but would always remain as a reminder of day 1, minute 1, hell, second 1. In those first moments, she was more concerned with what the hell was going on than the burns leaving their marks on her new body. She caught her balance and regained composure. Her brain and eyes finally found an equilibrium after a few blinks and surveyed their new surroundings to find that she was in a small cabin. Most importantly, she was alone. So much of the population woke up to their new reality and found themselves face to face with others in the same situation. Not Margot. She was all alone. And she was a lot younger. Her new body was that of a man, a very rugged, handsome man in his late 20s or early 30s. He was tall, but not too tall, right around 6 feet, broad and muscular, the kind of man she had always been attracted to. She certainly never thought she would be one. As her brain continued to settle into its new reality, she couldn't help fawning over her newfound perfect vision. She spent 2 solid minutes opening and closing her new eyes, expecting things to return to their former failed state. But her sight remained intact. She examined this strange new body in the small bathroom mirror while cleaning and bandaging her burns. She was thankful to find a well-stocked first aid kit with plenty of gauze and bandages. The cabin was tiny, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, small lounge area with couch and television, bookshelves filled with outdoorsman-related books and magazines, small kitchen that didn't even have a table, just a counter with 2 stools, minimal decoration at best. It was clearly not the home of a person she had become. It was a hunting cabin in the middle of the woods, the kind of place you rent or perhaps own but only use occasionally. It was well stocked with hunting rifles and ammunition that Margot was thankful to have. She didn't yet know what was happening or whether she would need the guns, but she had a feeling she would. She knew how to handle a weapon. Her long-dead husband had fought in Korea and enjoyed hunting. Even though she never participated, she had a curious mind and thought it would be a good idea to learn how to use a gun just in case. Somehow, in ways she couldn't comprehend, just in case had just happened. The internet was still up and running by the time she got her bearings. Considering she was in the middle of the woods, it was a small miracle that the cabin had internet at all. Thanks to social media, she quickly learned that this was not an isolated incident. People all over the world had been themselves one moment, then someone else the next. Everyone was scared and confused. She found some live streams of what was happening in major cities and other densely populated areas and was instantly thankful to be isolated in the middle of the woods. It was absolute chaos. Planes falling from the sky, cars crashing everywhere, people running wild in the streets, looting, killing, and adding to the chaos. Sold-out sporting events back in the States turned into deadly riots. When the internet went down, Margot was still staring at the screen. She took stock of the cabin's supplies. There was enough food in the kitchen to last a few days. She went outside to examine the surroundings and immediately regretted not using GPS to figure out where she was while the internet was still up. Her best guess, based upon the decor of the cabin, was Eastern Europe. There was a freshly killed deer hanging upside down to drain near the house. Although she didn't know how to skin and prep a freshly killed animal to eat, there were some books on the shelves in the cabin. She'd learn. She was also thankful to find that the cabin had a generator and a meat freezer. Both would hold her over nicely while she waited out the apocalypse. About a half a mile from the cabin was a stream flowing with fresh water. Margot scooped some out and fed it into her mouth. She wasn't scared of bacteria. After all, 2 hours ago she was 91 and ready to die. Nothing wrong with taking some chances. The water was fine. Everything was fine. No, it was better than fine. She looked up at the sky, then down at her hands, those big, strong, healthy young hands, and couldn't believe her luck. The whole world had been flipped over and turned inside out. Yet there she was, all alone with everything she needed to survive for the near future. Eventually, she would have to figure things out. She would be forced to leave this place, this sanctuary, but not for a while. By then, she hoped she'd be re-entering a world that was a little less crazy than the one currently awaiting her, the one she saw on the internet before it went down. She was in no hurry for that day to come. In her 91 years of life in the old world, Margot had lived through the majority of the 20th century and its most impactful events. She was barely 10 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the United States was drawn into World War II. She was still in high school when her slightly older boyfriend and future husband was shipped off to Korea. By the time he returned, she was working full-time as a seamstress. They were married 1 year later and brought their first child into the world nearly 1 year after that. On the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated, she was getting her kids ready for school. None of them made it out the door that morning. They sat in front of the television in shock like it was their job, only moving to use the restroom or prepare and eat food. In front of the same television, nearly 6 years later, the entire family gathered to watch the moon landing. 1 year after that, her only son was shipped off to Vietnam. He would return 2 years later with 2 bullet wounds and some bad memories. Yet, he still fared better than most. By the 1980s, she and her husband had become empty nesters. As the decade ended, they were grandparents. Her husband soft retired in the mid-90s, and they both went to work for their youngest daughter's husband. He had an entrepreneurial spirit and had opened a bar-restaurant in town. Margot became the main hostess, while her husband spent 5 nights a week tending bar. It kept them both sharp and active. It was during this period that she and her husband also saw the world. London, Paris, Barcelona, Madrid, Tokyo, Rome, Florence, Dublin, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and many more. She had to wait until 2015 to become a great-grandmother. By then, she was a widow, having lost her husband to lung cancer in 2009. She was still helping at the restaurant, which had grown to become a local favorite. By 2020, she was fully retired and living with her son and his family. Her body beginning to fail, she spent most of her time looking after her great-grandchildren. In the summer of 2022, she agreed that it was time to move into a care facility, a decision that is often known to be difficult for aging people to accept. She handled it with the grace and dignity of someone who had lived well and was accepting of their reality. There was still plenty she could do there. She did as much as she could for as long as her body would allow. She really was close to the end when things changed over. It was only a matter of weeks, maybe even days, before her body succumbed to inevitability. 5 years and 4 months. That's how long she managed to stay isolated at the cabin, having no contact with the outside world. She had read every book on the shelf that was in English, some multiple times. She had mastered hunting, dressing, and cooking animals. She had built her new body to its physical peak. Speaking of the new body, even after 5 years, she still hadn't gotten used to it. She loved the newfound size, strength, youth, and health. But she simply did not love being a man. No matter how long she lived in that body, she would never get used to how it operated. She missed the graceful feminine body of her youth. She missed not having to deal with facial hair. Most of all, she did not like what was now between her legs, especially when it got aroused. Nearly every day she would be minding her own business, and then there it was. So she had to learn how to handle that herself. Even though it technically felt good, she hated it. It felt wrong, like she was abusing someone else's body. But it wasn't someone else's. It was hers. She had no choice but to get used to it. Regardless of these feelings about the man's body she now inhabited, she was still overall happy about the exchange. Trading in a dying 91-year-old body for a young, healthy one was a no-brainer. The inconveniences were just that, inconvenient. Not nearly as inconvenient as being on your deathbed. Spending 5 years alone in that body was one of the reasons she wanted to leave. She needed to be around people, especially those in similar situations. People she could talk about her situation with. People who could understand it since they were also experiencing it. It had made sense to remain isolated after what she saw online at the beginning, but time had passed. A lot of time. It was worth the risk. On top of all that, she was bored, plain and simple. After more than 5 years all alone, there was no way around it. She was bored. There's only so many times one can read and reread books and magazines about hunting and survival. A deck of cards can only get so much mileage with one person, no matter how much you like being alone. Eventually, everyone gets bored. Plus, she was curious. After the internet went down on that first day, it never came back. She had checked every day in hopes that somewhere there were people rebuilding society. There was a short-wave radio in the cabin, but all she had ever connected to was static. Some days she spent hours scanning the channels hoping to find a voice on the other line. How is no one trying to reach anyone? She'd wonder. There had never been any visitors. Not a single person had ever wandered their way out to wherever she was. She truly was alone. It was time to finally get out there and discover what was waiting. The final decision to leave the safety of the cabin came when her ammunition count reached 50 rifle rounds and 100 9mm rounds. She didn't want to burn it all on hunting and be forced to leave empty-handed. She had no idea what was out there. When she left, she was going to leave armed. Wherever she was, still likely Eastern Europe by her estimations, got cold in the winter. Very cold. Another thing she had enough of. So, she decided to leave in the spring and hopefully get where she was going before winter. She had never once bothered to drive or even start the beat-up old pickup truck that was parked outside the cabin. There had been no point in trying until now. She knew enough about cars to know you don't leave them sitting for over 5 years and expect them to run. Looking at the dead truck made her think of her husband. He likely would have felt at home in this strange new world. He had been a car guy and would have been disappointed to see her neglecting a perfectly good truck like that for 5 years. Should have started her up and ran her every now and then to keep her fresh. She could picture him saying it. He'd been dead for nearly 20 years, but it didn't matter. She could see him like he was there. He'd been wearing his old ratty blue jeans that were reserved for the weekends when he worked on cars or any of his various other projects. A true handyman who not only took pride in working with his hands, but in helping others understand how their things worked. He had taught her, their kids, and some of their grandkids how to change tires, change oil, use tools, fix sinks and toilets, and many other things. Of particular importance to Margot on the eve of her departure was his lesson on car batteries, particularly how if you let a car sit for an extended period without starting or running the engine, the battery will die. She hadn't done that. Now her truck was long dead. And there he was in those blue jeans and white t-shirt smoking one of those cigarettes that would eventually lead to his lung cancer and running a greasy hand through his brown hair. A cold can of beer not far from his immediate reach, shaking his head and saying, "What did I tell you, hon?" Then she took the image of the dead man from her head and replaced it with the common-sense reminder that even had she started it up every day, it still probably would be dead. After all, it had been more than 5 years. Still, it was nice to have an excuse to fantasize about her husband. He popped in a lot during her years in the cabin, making little cameos to remind her how to do this or that. His lessons on using a gun were specifically helpful. She even visualized him teaching her things he hadn't taught her in real life, things she learned via the books in the cabin. It was easier to pay attention when the voice in her head was his. Deep down, she had always assumed that either someone would eventually show up, or the dream would end. She'd wake up back in her old body in that nursing home bed, or she was already dead. This was someone's twisted idea of an afterlife. Nothing could be ruled out, no matter how strange it sounded. So, she set off on foot. She had thoroughly explored the area in roughly a 10-mile radius over the years, but knew there wasn't any sign of civilization within said radius. But there was a stream, one she had been using for water. She decided she would follow it. It also conveniently ran nearly parallel to the dirt road that the truck had used to get to the cabin. So, sooner or later, it would have to lead somewhere. And it did. After nearly 3 days, the forest gave way to a small town that was long abandoned. There were the remains of a few bodies. Otherwise, the place had been cleaned out and left to rot years earlier. She thought about the people who had raided it, what direction they had taken after they were done, how close they had come to heading her way. The place gave her the creeps, but she was tired, so after resting there for the night, she left, this time following the now paved road. It was 6 more days before she found actual living people, and friendly ones at that. They were camped out just off the road near the lake that the stream ran into. The one who had been on watch duty spotted Margot and approached her with gun drawn. He spoke German, but used hand signals that let Margot know to follow him. She didn't put up a fight. Instead, she did everything she could to let him know she wasn't a threat, including instantly dropping her rifle and putting her hands up. Her instinct told her that had this person in a man's body been a true threat, she would no longer be standing. He would have ended her and got on with his day. He took her to the makeshift campsite where the rest of his group was waiting. They all spoke German. Luckily, there was one who was bilingual and knew English. He confirmed that they were indeed in what was once known as Eastern Europe. Now it was just land. The man was living in a woman's body and told her that his name was William. He was from Hamburg, but his mother was from England, and he'd been raised bilingual. Lucky for Margot. He asked her where she wanted to go, and she said she wasn't sure. It was also her first real conversation in more than 5 years. Well, I guess, between my last few years before this, I guess before things, changed. And I guess my first years after, I suppose I wouldn't mind some adventure, see the world, meet people, she said, smiling. I'd head west, he said. Heard from a few different traders that some groups of people have organized and are looking to sail across the Atlantic. You know, helping people get home, I guess. Sounds like adventure to me. It sure did. After sharing a meal, Margot bid farewell to the Germans and began walking west. The journey west was rough. Margot killed 4 people within the first week. It was easier than she had expected, likely a result of spending more than 5 years killing animals for food. In the old world, she had weighed the lives of humans above animals. In the new world, with everything that had happened, a threat was a threat. Her first human kill did prove a bit challenging. It was a split-second decision. Someone wearing a young man's body leapt out from behind a dead car with a machete raised. Had Margot not always walked with her hunting rifle shouldered, she would have been dead in seconds. Instead, she got a shot off, but it was low. Instead of hitting the attacker in the chest like she had hoped, it got him in the stomach. She watched in curious horror as his guts leaked out onto the pavement, making sloshing sounds as they landed in a pile. The person in the young man's body looked down at their spilling guts, then at Margot. Just before the life faded from his eyes, he muttered something in a language Margot didn't understand. Then he fell dead atop his insides. The next 3 proved much easier. One had fired a wild shot with a handgun from about 50 yards away. Margot ducked behind the corner of a building, lined up a shot with her rifle, and drilled them in the chest. 2 days later, she heard shots not far away. She ran to them and found 2 people in women's bodies rifling through the bags and pockets of 3 people they had just killed. They never saw Margot as she dropped them from behind. Luckily, she eventually found 8 peaceful travelers whose minds belonged to English-speaking Americans that were also headed west. Her encounter with them played out like one with the Germans. The one on watch duty spotted her and ambushed her. After a brief conversation, she agreed to take Margot back to camp. They were part of a newly formed trading company based out of a settlement in what used to be Greece. They were traveling across the continent looking for other peaceful settlements to form trade routes with. It was their first trip, an exploratory mission. The idea intrigued Margot. The world was reorganizing, but in new and different ways. She looked forward to seeing what else was out there. It also happened that these traders were heading toward the place she had heard about, the place to the west with the ship. So, she asked if she could tag along, and they welcomed her. The traders liked having Margot around, not just because her new physical specimen of a body proved extremely useful, but because she was interesting as hell. All of them were younger, and loved listening to the stories and wisdom of someone in their 90s. They were also jealous of how she spent her first 5 years in the New World in total safety and isolation. While they were all fighting to survive, she was laying low. She really had been one of the luckier ones. There were lots of interesting things to see on the journey. Most were unpleasant. She saw more dead bodies in various states of decay than she would have liked. Most had been dead since the beginning, or close to it, and had been left to the animals and insects. As they moved further west, they began to come upon fresher bodies. Bodies that had been mutilated and left on display for all who passed by. From the neck down, there was no pattern to their mutilation. Each had their own custom job. All were brutal and sadistic. The main thing they all had in common was that their faces had been skinned and their eyes removed. Each body was missing both its face and eyes. The facial skin and eyes were always nearby, too, often being clutched in the poor victim's dead hands. "This is all the same person," said Margot after seeing the fourth body in as many days. "Yeah," said one of the traders. "Best stay on our toes." Many towns they passed had been reduced to rubble or scavenged and abandoned, while some had been spared and settled. The levels of settlement varied. Some were just populated by a handful of people who would struggle just to survive through winter. Others were trying to be smart and productive, trying to grow. Some were open to the idea of trade. Most were not. For those willing to trade, the group had to follow their rules. The one constant rule was always that the group had to remain outside the settlement's borders. They didn't want to risk letting a killer within their walls. They had all seen the skinned bodies. Once trading was done, the group was sent on their way. This was a new world. You couldn't trust people. Any mind could be hiding in any body, and that was terrifying. When the group reached the Adriatic Sea, they had a decision to make. The original plan had been to stay on land and travel north up the coast until they could once again move west. Instead, they crossed the sea from what was once Croatia into what was once Italy. The decision had been made the morning after they lost one of their members. He was a man living in a young woman's body. He must have wandered off while everyone else was asleep. No one heard a sound, at least not loud enough to be noticed. In the morning, they found him not 50 feet from the campsite. His hands and feet had been cut off, the skin from his face removed, and his eyeballs carved out and placed in his mouth. The group decided unanimously to cross the sea in hopes of escaping the path of this strange, terrifying killer. It wasn't difficult. They were only 2 days' walk from the water. During that journey, they never left each other's sight, not even to use the bathroom. People had lost all sense of self-consciousness about their bodies in the New World since no one was in their true body. As a result, no one batted an eyelash at the idea of going to the bathroom in front of others like they may have in the Old World. Once they reached the shore, they traveled north along the coast until finding a suitable boat. Margot had done some sailing with her husband and happily captained everyone to the other side. The only downside was that they had to leave their land-bound transportation behind along with all the items they had brought for trading. This was the early days of the still unnamed fledgling trading company. As a result of this specific experience and a few others, future caravans would be well armed and better guarded than the haphazard, disorganized watch duty they were currently using. Losing cargo would one day be unacceptable. At that moment, their lives were more important. In Italy, they would not see any further victims of that killer, but there were still some very fascinating encounters. The most of which surely being when they came across the first pure-born any of them had seen. He was a boy of barely 5 years old. He was helping his parent work in the fields of a farming settlement in what had once been Tuscany. It was an incredible and impressive place in and of itself. An old castle that had been a winery and a hotel in the old world and had since been converted into a secure farming settlement, complete with its own militia. After all Margot had seen to that point, this place was the first to truly give her hope for a future in this new world. The talk of a place to the west trying to send ships back across the ocean was at present nothing more than talk. This place was real. They were building something. They had built something. It wasn't like the ramshackle attempts at settlements they had encountered back east. If it was happening there, it could be happening elsewhere. It made her more excited about heading west. For as impressive as the settlement was, its most fascinating feature was surely the young boy. To be only 5 years old, over 5 years after everything changed over, could only mean one thing. He was born after it happened. More than 9 months after it happened. That meant he was conceived in the new world, and that his body matched his mind. The parent of the pure-born child turned out to be a man who had jumped into a woman's body. Margot didn't need to be a detective to see that this man had been through a lot since things changed over. The woman's body he wore was small and petite. This was apparent despite his efforts to hide it beneath baggy clothes. There were multiple teeth missing from his mouth. It was hard to tell how many, since he never smiled and only opened his mouth to speak. When he did speak, he said very little. Plus, there was just a noticeable air of sadness about him. None of this deterred him from his parental duties. He was very protective of the pureborn and refused to give up any more information than was necessary, reciting his responses as if they were lines in a script, a result of having been asked the same questions an untold amount of times. Yes, he was born after. Yes, his mind and body are aligned. No, I will not tell you his name. Made sense to Margot. She would have done the same and was glad she didn't have to be in such a position. Eventually, the parent grew tired of the curious travelers and took his child back behind the gates and into the settlement. Like with most places they visited, Margot and her merchant friends were not allowed within the walls of the old castle winery resort. Most people would be jealous of a pureborn. Not Margot. Despite all the dangers of the new world, she was happy with her new life. Even if she didn't love dealing with the intricacies of a man's body. After all, she had been on the brink of death before all this. Now she was young and healthy again, while getting to keep all the memories and knowledge she'd gained in her old life. She was essentially getting 2 lives for the price of 1. Very few people made out as well as she had, so she never let on how much she enjoyed it, especially since so many others were miserable and longed for a return to their old bodies and old lives. She was determined to do something with it. She just needed to figure out what. After the encounter with the pureborn and his parent, the group enjoyed one other interesting aspect of the settlement. The inn. The winery and hotel had been perched atop a hill and surrounded by farmland, with a long road leading through a section of said farmland to the winery and hotel. Long before it was a hotel, it had been a castle, and therefore had thick walls and a gate. This made it the ideal place for a closed-off settlement. At the bottom of the hill where the road to the winery hotel intersected with a greater countryside thoroughfare was what had been a small restaurant in the old world, a place where the travelers could stop to enjoy a meal and some wine without having to visit the actual winery. Once people of the settlement got the old castle hotel winery in order, they rehabbed the old restaurant and made it into an inn where travelers could stop to eat, rest, trade, and socialize. Margot and her merchant friends' visit had occurred during the first summer of the inn being open. The inn was well protected with its own security detail. All visitors had to check their weapons upon entry. There was plenty of food and drink available for trade. They were open to all sorts of trade. Since Margot and her merchant friends had left all their inventory back east when fleeing the killer, they traded information. They told of the killer back east who was mutilating bodies and removing faces and eyes. They told of how they had seen it firsthand when a member of their group had become a victim, how they had sacrificed their transportation and cargo to ensure no one else of their numbers would fall victim. The innkeeper had not yet heard of killings this specific. Murder, serial killers, raiders, and the like had become commonplace in the New World. Someone consistently removing facial skin and eyes was cause for alarm, something to keep tabs on. The information was deemed worthy of a fine meal before the group was sent on their way. As they neared the Atlantic, they were only 7. It was an unavoidable reality of the New World. If you traveled far and long enough without proper protection, you were bound to run into trouble. They had met a group of raiders somewhere in what had once been known as the south of France. A firefight ensued. Margot and her merchant friends were victorious, but it came at a cost. By the time they reached the coast, they were on their last legs. Their weapons had little ammunition. They had no food. They were getting desperate. None of that mattered anymore once they saw the coastline. They had made it. That was what mattered. That was all that mattered now. They followed the coast north until seeing it. It was impossible to miss it or mistake it. The most impressive place they had seen since the Castle Winery. A harbor loaded with ships, mostly smaller fishing vessels and a handful of sailboats. Anchored a little further offshore sat a large cruise ship. The sight of the fleet of sailboats dotting the waters around the settlement brought Margot back to her old life. Years before. Decades before. Back in the 1950s, her husband took her sailing for the first time. It was off the coast of Michigan. His family had a cabin that they would visit every summer until he inherited it upon his mother's death in 1986. After which they put it on the market and sold it almost immediately. They always remembered it fondly, but their kids had grown up, and the visits had become something to dread instead of something to look forward to. Back to the 1950s. Her future husband had recently returned from Korea, and he invited her out to Michigan for a relaxing week at the cabin. He had seen some things in the war and had been overwhelmed since getting out. The cabin was his sanctuary, and he wanted her there with him. She had heard about the cabin from their time together before he left for the war, but had not yet been. They took a nice scenic route across Ohio and Michigan, stopping along the way for a night at a motel before arriving on a Friday afternoon. The following morning, they were up bright and early. After a breakfast of eggs and bacon, they headed out on the sailboat. They didn't simply get in the boat and go. Margot's future husband gave her a full top-to-bottom lesson on sailboats and how to operate them. By the end of that first excursion, they were sailing together as a team. The next day, they went back out. Once they had reached a nice distance from the dock, they dropped anchor and enjoyed a picnic of pre-made sandwiches and beer. After the meal, he dropped to a knee and proposed. For the rest of Margot's first life and her second, she could never look at a sailboat and not think of that weekend, of that day. It was perfect, absolutely perfect. There was something about seeing those sailboats after such a long journey that gave her a sense of hope and confidence that something good was waiting for her at this mysterious seaside settlement. The perimeter of the impressive coastal settlement was walled off and well armed. Whomever had established it was exceptionally organized and not messing around. Margot and her merchant friends were greeted by an armed welcoming party 50 yards out from the gate. There were 10 people in the squad. Had they approached with violent intent, Margot and company wouldn't have stood a chance. They were too exhausted and worn down from the journey. They would have been overwhelmed in seconds. Fortunately, they looked anything but threatening, and the welcoming party wisely viewed them as a non-threat. There were 10 members in the welcoming party, and each could speak at least one of the major languages. Among them, they had the following covered: English, Spanish, French, German, Chinese, Japanese, Italian, Dutch, and Arabic. Margot was instantly impressed. She and her merchant friends communicated with the 3 who spoke English. They stated their purpose and answered some general questions. Where they had come from, who they had been in the old world, things like that. Once they were deemed to not likely be threats, they were ordered to hand over all weapons, which they did without question or hesitation. When they were directed to follow the welcoming party into the settlement to meet with the council to determine if they could be allowed in. The process ran about as smooth as something like it could. Margot and her merchant friends each individually sat before the council and answered more questions about themselves. These went beyond the basic surface-level questions asked by the welcoming party. The council wanted to get inside their heads to pull out the true identity of whomever was lurking inside. Most of the questions were asked by someone in a man's body who claimed to have the mind of a man as well. He was the head of the council, clearly someone who knew how to read people. Margot assumed that whoever lived in that body had been a detective or something similar in the old world. There were plenty of trick questions and out-of-pocket questions meant to catch a fraud off guard. He asked her strange things like when she first had sex and what it felt like. He asked her about her old body's menstruation cycles, since she claimed to have the mind of a woman. He asked her questions about America, since she said she was American. It went on and on and on for more than 2 hours. Margot had no issues with any of it. She understood the need for extreme caution. and she had nothing to hide. Two members of the council had also been old and become young just like Margot, and enjoyed talking to others in the same fortunate position. They asked her where she was when Kennedy had been assassinated, during the moon landing, and other important events from the 50s through the 70s. This aspect of the interview did well to endear Margot to those older members of the council. They also dove deep into trying to understand her business in Portstown, which was what they had named the settlement. She told them the truth. She was looking for adventure. She wanted to get on a boat and travel across the Atlantic. From there, she wasn't sure, but she was excited to find out. After little deliberation, the council unanimously agreed to let her in and booked her for the first attempted voyage to what used to be the United States that was scheduled for the following spring. It was estimated that the ship would not be ready for another 2 to 3 months. By then, it would be fall and too risky to travel across the ocean. As a result, Margot would be living in Portstown until then. As far as the merchants Margot had traveled with, Portstown leadership agreed to a trial run trading with their company. They also allowed the merchants to stay through the winter to rest and recover after their voyage. Come spring, they would be outfitted with fresh horses and sent home. As for Margot, until the day of her voyage, she would have to work. Everyone who stayed in Portstown had to work. Portstown was a living, breathing, thriving seaside community on the coast of what used to be France. It was beautiful. It had been completely walled off in the years since everything changed over. Almost no one who lived there ever left. Only a select group of designated representatives stepped outside the walls to deal with traders, travelers, emissaries, raiders, wanderers, and other visitors both friendly and unfriendly. Parts of the town had been converted into gardens, but most food came from fishing. They also traded fish with a nearby inland settlement that had a healthy supply of livestock. In just over 5 years, new civilizations had risen up in place of the old ones. Things would never be like they'd been. Most major cities were completely lost. Too many people had died. Many who had survived would never recover from the trauma they experienced after everything changed over. But for those who made it through the initial chaos, it was a second chance. An opportunity to do things different. Be part of the birth of a new world. Margot's job for the 9 months she spent waiting for her voyage was fishing. They always needed extra hands on the boats, and although she had been sailing with her husband, children, and friends many times, she had never once picked up a fishing rod. Their trips out on the water in the old days were more about socializing and relaxing. On more than one occasion, her husband had invited her out fishing with him and one or both of their sons, but she elected to let it be a father and son bonding thing. While the boys were out on the water, she enjoyed mother-daughter time with the girls. Once she got a feel for fishing, she regretted having never tried it in the past. It was a perfect pastime for her. She loved being out on the water, even if it wasn't far from the shore. A thought that crossed her mind often while casting her lure was how, had everything not changed over, she would have died without ever experiencing the joy of fishing. The years killing, dressing, and cooking deer and other wildlife in the woods also came in handy with the fish. Gutting, deboning, and preparing a fish was easy compared to deer, rabbit, and squirrel. During her short time there, she managed to become a real contributor to life in Portstown. She made a few friends, too. The only thing she was unable to get a foothold on was romance. And there were opportunities. Not for real romance of substance. After all, she was leaving for what used to be America soon. But for breeding, established settlements like Portstown had begun attempting to repopulate the world with pureborn children, whose minds would match their bodies like the young boys she had met back at that castle settlement. The body Margot now inhabited was considered an ideal breeding vessel. Big, strong, healthy, and fit. The kind of genes worth passing on. If she had been willing to go through with it, she could have had sex with any of the available volunteers who were living in ideal breeding female bodies. Even after more than 5 years in her new body, she still wasn't interested in taking it for a sexual test drive other than the routine maintenance. She did that while alone and still could not bring herself to enjoy it. Instead, she chose to dedicate her time in Portstown to focusing on work and friendship. Maybe someday she'd figure the romance out. If not the romance part, perhaps the physical part, the breeding. Maybe not. She had experienced plenty of love in her first life and was okay with not having any in her second. The voyage was taken on an old cruise ship. By this point, gas was gone, but some of the more mechanically gifted people in Portstown had modified the ship to make it usable, a process that had taken more than 5 years. This trip across the Atlantic and all that followed would be much slower than they had once been, and it was full of uncertainty. No one knew for sure if they would make it, but they did. They reached the east coast of what was once known as America safely. Margot spent her first week or so either walking the deck and taking in the view or socializing with other travelers. Having lived a full life, she was living her new one without fear. Instead, she approached everything with excitement and curiosity, qualities that continued to endear her to everyone she met. Eventually, she began the education portion of the trip, shadowing crew members as well as the captain, learning all she could about the work they were doing to get from one coast to the other. She fell in love with it, with everything about it. Being out on the open water was pure bliss, total freedom. Upon arriving on the east coast of what used to be America, the ships and its crew found themselves in a tricky situation: where to drop anchor and head to land. When the coast finally did appear on the horizon, they had no idea where on the continent they were. As they got closer, they saw buildings and decided that was where they would make contact. It turned out that the buildings were occupied and that the ship had landed upon an up-and-coming settlement. The ship's captain and some crew members met with the officials of the settlement, and an arrangement was made. Soon, Margot and everyone else on the ship was welcomed into the settlement. There was even a feast held in their honor. When asked where she planned to go next, Margot was honest. "I don't know." She spent the first night in one of the rooms that had formerly been part of a seaside motel, tossing and turning, unable to make up her mind about where to go and what to do next. She kept coming back to the ship and how much she had loved the voyage, how much she loved being at sea. Then it was settled. She knew what she must do and soon fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, she approached the ship's captain and let him know she wanted to join the crew. "Perfect," he said. "Just lost 4 who want to stay. Welcome aboard." It was that easy. A few days later, Margot boarded the ship and headed back east, this time as a crew member. She would spend the next 5 years as a deckhand on that ship. When Scavenger Allies managed to salvage another old cruise ship and make it seaworthy, Portstown would add it to their fleet. Margot would be named captain of it. She would spend the rest of her second life ferrying passengers from one side of the Atlantic to the other. She would meet people of all origins and learn their stories, the memory of her old life fading further and further away with each voyage.